My name's Darren Govey from Renesas Electronics. Renesas are the world's largest supplier of microcontrollers with over 20 years' experience with secure microcontrollers. We've shipped over 3 billion secure devices so far. I'm here to talk to you about security in the smart grid, smart metering context. The message really is that without a solid foundation of security, everything could be compromised. That means that you need to design it in from the start. Security cannot be effectively retrofitted. It needs to start at the meter as well. It's not just a top-down from the network side of things. My view is that you need to make sure that your meter is secure, especially as it's one of the most vulnerable components of the network. So let's have a look at some of the motivations for attacking the grid. Obviously there's the low-level mischief, switching someone's energy supply off, but also data theft on individual basis, maybe for targeting burglaries at empty properties, but also large scale if you're looking at the server side vulnerabilities. The bigger worries are of synchronized attacks, cyber warfare, disruption of the critical infrastructure, especially when you consider this could be sponsored by foreign states with very large resources to throw at this. We've seen some examples of foreign state or state-sponsored cyber attacks. I'll move on to that a little later. The problem is that synchronized attack could actually damage the grid itself. It may not just be a problem of outage, it may actually cause damage. Another possibility is financial gain. Obviously an individual has an incentive to defraud for reducing their cost of energy. We've seen increased levels of cannabis farms and things like that, which obviously have a slightly greater financial benefit there. I think there were 7,000 cannabis farms in the UK that were found last year, and the energy theft from each of those was quite significant. But organised crime is another area. If someone had developed an exploit that would compromise the network or a meter, the possibility that they might use either a protection type racket, if you don't pay me this amount of money, I'll release this virus. That could be one method. But there's more clever ways that they could also profit from this, such as using the stock market to effectively bet on the stock going down. So by shorting stock, I'm not an economist, but effectively borrowing shares at a high price, selling them to someone else at a high price, doing something that influences the share prices, and then buying them back when the prices have crashed before returning them to the person that they've borrowed them from. So what can we do to lessen the risk? Well, use of cryptography has to be a good start, but it's not the entire solution. So we're talking about using cryptography for authentication to prevent unauthorized access and to prevent incorrect data being fed back. Rigorous design and test procedures. Most vulnerabilities are caused through mistakes in coding. It's incredible to look at the stats of how many lines of code there are before you find a bug, even for very well-inspected code. So really, testing has got to be key to this, to avoid the software vulnerabilities. A controlled life cycle, so not just for the rollout and the activation, but also for the decommissioning and disposal. The meters themselves could securely log and report tamper attempts. That's the emphasis there has got to be on securely logging, because there's no good logging it if the system is compromised. And the key storage, I'm thinking here both in terms of at the meter side and at the server side, is critical. There's been a lot of attacks recently based on stolen or compromised keys. So yeah, this has got to include the keys and certificates in the meter itself. That poses a particular challenge for how do you do that? What's classed as secure? And separate keys for separate uses, so that if in the event of a key compromise, the effect of that has got to be minimised. So authentication, it's got to be one of the primary requirements for smart metering particularly. Just as the meter has to be able to verify who's giving it instructions, especially if you're supporting remote updates of firmware, it's also important that the server side can validate that it is indeed the meter it believes feeding it correct information, not an imposter or a cloned meter that's the same meter ID as a number of others. So encryption has got to be used to prevent data snooping. It needs to be there to prevent man-in-the-middle attacks, whereby some third party is accessing the data, intercepting it and manipulating it before passing it on. And in my view, end-to-end encryption is more secure than point-to-point. The reason being that with point-to-point encryption, where you're talking about encrypting from one node to the next node, then decrypting and re-encrypting with maybe different technology, each point that data is decrypted, that's a vulnerability. That's an opportunity for someone to access that data. The problem with that, of course, from the metering side is that you need to have the compatible algorithms implemented on the meter as well as at the data center. And with the metering side, as we've just heard about power, especially if you consider gas meters where they're running on battery power for 10, 15 years perhaps, then that poses some particular challenges also. So it sounds simple, but security is hard, and many other industries have discovered this. So for good security, we need strong encryption. The problem we face with metering is that meters have very limited processing power. For good security, we need physical security. The problem we face is that meters are being installed in domestic properties without regular inspections, especially if they're being read remotely. Restricted availability is normally something that we'd look for good security, restrict the supply of the secure devices. We're talking about rolling out millions of meters, so it doesn't really count as restricted availability. End-to-end encryption and authentication, I've just mentioned that. We'll see which way things go as time goes on. Separate keys for separate uses, I've mentioned, and ensuring the communications protocol isn't vulnerable. So it's key to make sure that your data isn't going to be compromised en route. So other industries have faced some severe difficulties. DVDs, the encryption technology, or the restrictions placed on DVDs, that technology was cracked famously by a 16-year-old very shortly after the release of DVDs. And Blu-ray, similarly, shortly after the release of Blu-ray, the content protection was cracked. Credit cards, there's always been a lot of investment to prevent credit card fraud. If you think back to the hologram in the initial days and smart cards. And similarly with mobile phones as well. There's a certain level of security that they now demand if you want to be a player in that market. And I don't see that smart metering should be any different. I think that there should be minimum standards for security to prevent problems. Voting machines. There was an example of an American electronic voting system designed to be secure by design. There was a lot of effort put into trying to prevent any sort of hacks for this. Yet there was a vulnerability demonstrated with relatively small amount of effort. I think it was 9 man-months. And that compromised the system. They could do what they wanted with it, despite the fact that the code was in a read-only area, so they couldn't reprogram it at all. They managed to get in with a buffer overflow, classic software vulnerability, and then use the tail ends of existing subroutines in the voting machine itself to accomplish everything they needed to do in order to compromise the system. And they built up a library of commands by jump to this address to use the existing code to do what they wanted. And pay TV has always been a bit of a cat and mouse game between the providers and those who don't pay for their subscriptions. And the level of security has gone up over the years. We've also seen some bigger attacks, some more worrying attacks, such as the government-sponsored hacking. Stuxnet has had a lot of press attention recently, as have the IMF and RSA vulnerabilities recently. Stuxnet was really the first verifiable government-sponsored hacking example. This was an attack that was targeted at the Iranian nuclear program, and it's widely believed that it must have been sponsored by foreign states because the amount of resources that would have been required, including access to centrifuges of particular makes and models. But this one, they managed to bypass even the air-gap security. So the Iranian centrifuges were on a network that was clearly not going to be connected to the internet, for example, but by using a Windows worm that spread throughout Windows computers but didn't show its face, didn't actually harm the Windows computers. It managed to spread to the computers that were being used to program the system in the Iranian nuclear program. And that way, and using some previously unknown hacks, I think there were 4 previously unknown rootkits that were used, including one that was on the Siemens programmable logic controller, which was the first time anything of that sort had been discovered. It hid itself very well and managed to knock out, it's believed, about 10% of the Iranian nuclear centrifuges. So that set their program back considerably. But you can imagine what the security levels would have been to prevent that sort of attack, yet they managed to bypass even the air-gap security by using USB sticks as a vector for transferring across that air-gap. Spear phishing attacks are getting more common. So this is looking at the sort of server side, the corporate culture and company side, that if you've got certificates on your network, you need to make sure there's adequate protection, that those are being stored securely and they're not going to be vulnerable. So Google had an attack where it was a very targeted attack. The code was written specifically to get at a resource in Google. It got in through, I think, an invitation via Facebook, I think. Once it was on the network, it spidered their network until it found machines that had the required access levels to the code repositories, where it started stealing code and sending that out, it's believed, to China for whatever purpose that was. And we've seen attacks on routers. So what were believed to be genuine, they looked genuine routers, they'd been compromised before they'd been brought into the country. So as part of the manufacturing process. So this goes back to the control of supply, and how do you know that your product is genuine and it hasn't already been compromised before you get your hands on it. So, just as you shouldn't fit a high security lock and leave the key in the door, you shouldn't leave your cryptographic keys unprotected. So this is in the meters and on the networks. Standard microcontrollers can't store the keys securely. It's a bold statement, but it's pretty much true that there's many techniques available to extract the keys from a microcontroller if it doesn't employ countermeasures. And many vulnerabilities have been as a result of incorrect usage of the cryptographic technology. So ensure that your keys are using sufficient entropy in the random number generation. So why are standard microcontrollers inadequate? Well, they normally offer a read protection flag of some description, maybe a password or a bit that's set. The problem is that doesn't prevent attacks. So there can be power analysis is a way that even just using something as simple as a resistor in line with the power supply, you can glean information about what's going on in the processor. While it's processing that key, the power consumption can vary. Timing analysis, similarly, if you don't mask the operations with sort of fake operations in your code, then you may be able to detect which branch of if-else statements the code is taking, and where you're comparing keys on a bit-by-bit basis, that can very simply, by analysing the timing, give you the key, or at least enough of the clue to the key to be able to reduce the attack from something that's unfeasible to something that's very easy.
2 minutes.
Okay. Voltage glitching, fuse resetting, other attacks, as well as chip erase. Sometimes the keys get copied into RAM, and you may be able to erase that device, but the contents of the RAM remain, so that you can then use entropy analysis to easily identify those keys. So, a secure microcontroller provides protection against physical attack, using metal shields and random layouts, against leakage attacks, against the power analysis and timing attacks, and fault attacks. So it's actively looking for violations of access and shuts down if it detects such things. So, in summary, a secure microcontroller provides secure key storage. It also provides, going back to what Robert was saying about power, it provides the opportunity to have a hardware accelerator, so a coprocessor, specifically for the cryptographic operations. And that's very important, especially where you consider battery-powered meters. Anti-cloning, so this is going back to the example of the fake routers. So if you are guaranteeing that your chip has a unique ID and nobody is able to copy that, no one else can pretend to be your device, then you'll guarantee that that's the device you're talking to. Secure credit and log storage, so especially for prepayment meters where you're going to need to store potentially financial value, but at least a pointer to the financial value. That's important. Onboard key generation is another possibility, whether you use it or not. Depends on the nature of your cryptographic keys. So in that way, you can generate the key and the key pair so that the private key never leaves that device. Because once you start copying the private key off, then there's an opportunity for that to be compromised. Proper random number generation, as well as very good pseudo-random number generation, is something else that a secure microcontroller provides, as well as validated cryptographic algorithms. I think that's it.
Thank you.